I talk about plants, for example, gardening. So we'll see what happens. This project, though, is a bit more about a kind of an institutional critique. And you can think of it, or I think of this as it's a brief introduction to a book that I will never write, for many reasons. Maybe we'll explore those. Who can tell? The upshot here, though, is to ask what would happen if we move our aesthetic inquiry out of the white boxes of galleries and museums and into the domestic sphere. And my interest there, am I losing this microphone? My interest there would be not simply to move that inquiry, but also to affect institutional change. So what would it really do to our museums and our galleries, as well as our schools, if we move that inquiry that way? Now I want to spend a lot of time talking about why we should do this. And one reason we should do this is because we face wicked problems in this world. And wicked problems is a somewhat well-known phrase in the 1960s that we use in design studies a lot. It has to do with problems that are intractable. Things like climate change, issues of sustainability and pollution. Problems that are ill-defined and hard to communicate, hard to address because they move across many platforms and fields. So how do we get into and affect actual change in these problems? How do I move? One key premise for me is that argument never really gets us anywhere. I'm making an argument right now, and that's problematic for my argument. Nevertheless, people can convince themselves of all kinds of stuff, and I love this quote from evolutionary theorists, but I mean it's true. No evidence is powerful enough to force acceptance of a conclusion that is emotionally distasteful. When we want to believe something, we're going to believe it. When we need it, we need it. So no matter how much information we have, often information is not enough to get us where we need to go. Blaise Pascal also said that humans need reason and that which exceeds reason in order to live. And I think that's a similar statement. So the space I like to think in is the space of ecological imagination. So this is ecological thought, the rational explanation of what ecology involves. But I'm interested in heuristics, ways that we can spur ourselves into ecological awareness embodied. Ecology. So let's think about this for a few minutes. Ecology, and I love to look at etymologies. Ecology, ekologos, oikos logos in the Greek. What do we mean by this? The Greek word oikos means household, is the basic unit of Greek society. The household includes the house, everything in it, but also everything around it that supports that house. So the family farm, everything that sustains the family. Now logos is a word that we know. Logos is a descriptor that comes from and about language, so it's a grounding and a plea, an opinion, an expectation, a speech, an account, a reason. It's word in its broadest connotation. So for the Greeks, for the sophists, it's any type of speech. For the philosopher Heraclitus, it's an order, and he's often very obscure about this. Aristotle uses the word logos in context where he means something like a reasoned argument, and that's why translations into Latin of Aristotle use the word ratio to mean logos. So we can see that logos has a lot of different kind of things: reason, measure, logic come out of it. For Christians, of course, logos is God, and the beginning was the word logos. So oikos logos is the order or arrangement of the household, the ratio or measure of the house. But that's somewhat close. I mean, it's not somewhat. It's extremely close to this other related word, oikonomia, economy, which has to do with the management of that household. The nomos, the nomia, is the customer law, but it's also the manager, the one who manages the household. That's the kind of stuff I'm interested in. How do we learn to manage our household? So oikosnomia, the management or law of the house, we can take that back into Latin. Lex domus, the laws of the house. house, or the ars domus, the domestic arts. That's what I want to think about. The ars vivendi, the art of living. How do we bring these things into ourselves? Now, stepping back to ecology for a moment, we can say that ecology is a new science. As a science, it's the study of habitats, it's the study of the spaces that support our life, and I don't know what to say about that, but study of place, life of a place. In modern science, the science of Francis Bacon, of Galileo Galilei, of René Descartes, we often try and separate things, and this I'm just taking from Descartes' Discourse on Method. We try and break problems down into their smallest manageable bits so that you can get a firm answer. Modern science is a science of separation and reduction in that manner. Ecology attempts to go in the opposite direction. Ecology is a science of connection. So ecology is a challenge to science. If modern science breaks things down, ecology tries to add them up. And that's another challenge for this issue of reasoned argument. How do we work at the boundaries of science and beyond them? So the ecological imagination is an imagination in search of connectivity, in search of order, the order of our household, but it's a search for images and patterns, heuristics that will lead us beyond our reason. Another word to play around with in this space is the word habitus. A bunch of French sociologists, Pierre Bourdieu in particular, have made a lot about the word habitus and what it means. Comes from a root that means to have or hold, with this suffix thus to indicate action. So habitus involves an action of having or holding. That's to say that it's a way of being in the world. I love thinking about this word because it's a word that means to inhabit, to be in a place, to inhabit that place. But a habit can also be a mental habit. It can be a characteristic gesture, a mode of speech. A habit can also be a physical tic, a way of moving in the world. A habit can also be, of course, a mode of clothing that a nun might wear. So a habit is this thing that is internal to us. It's part of our mentality. It's characteristic of us. But it can also be this slightly external mode of clothing, but also this way of gestural interaction with the world, as well as this way of dwelling in the world more broadly, this habitat. Now, when I think of habitat, I often think about Gregory Bateson's great revision of Darwinism, where Bateson said that the unit of survival is not the organism as an individual organism, as a family, or as a society, but it's an organism plus its environment. So how do we live in our habitat? And if we destroy our habitat, we destroy ourselves. This is Gregory Bateson's environmentalism. So what I'm looking for in an ecological imagination is this habitus that is a domestic art. Now, why do we need this? We need this, again, because of those wicked problems. We need this because of what the German philosopher Theodor Adorno called the problem of damaged life in our time. And I love this quote from Adorno's Minima Moralia: the abundance of commodities indiscriminately consumed is becoming calamitous. And what he's talking about is the fact in that book, is the fact that commodity culture it assaults us with this blizzard of options for engagement, purchase, consumption. And we don't know how to make those choices. We don't know what to buy, why to buy. And so we say, okay, it's up to personal choice, individual choice. I'm just going to get this. This is my favorite. The exercise of personal choice. That's not helping all that much. So the subtitle of Adorno's book is, of course, Reflections from Damaged Life. And we can take that phrase damaged life to mean a lot of different things. Great story in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago about some counties in Kentucky with major problems in obesity, unemployment. I used to teach in some of those counties, and so I know what it's like to be there. And to think about the kind of things that people need to learn in those places. Adorno begins his book by saying that what he's trying to talk about is the good life, how to live. Now, Guy Debord, in his book Society of Spectacle, attacks these same problems in a slightly different way. Debord talks about the transition in section 17 here, from being to having, which he, as a Marxist, denigrates profoundly, this idea of having. For him, that's private property, that's the root of the problem. To appearing in what he calls our society, the society of spectacle. But what if we try and link these things in a more productive way? Think about what having is, distinct from merely criticizing having. Now, domestic arts. We think home ec, and probably everybody in the room at some point went to some kind of a home ec class. My wife loves to say how she got a C in home ec. It was her only C in high school, kept her from being valedictorian. Where we learned to sew, we learned a few things here and there. And we can denigrate the history of home ec, we can praise it. I love the fact that there's a school of ecology at Cornell University that houses programs in design, environment, in home economics. And yet somehow it doesn't quite capture our imagination in this contemporary moment and in our educational structures. Part of the challenge is that it's one thing to study design, to become a designer in separation from the world, and it's another thing to ask people to design their life. A few years ago, Matthew Crawford published a pretty interesting little book called Shop Class is Soulcraft, where he sang the praises of the trades, of the manual arts, of, in his case, repairing motorcycles. Because repairing motorcycles, as he observes, is a great way to be in the world. It's a way to be attentive to things in your space immediately. It's a way to set real limits, checks and balances on the success or failure of what you're doing. And it's unfairly, in his argument, denigrated in our culture, devoted as we are largely to the symbolic knowledge worker. And here we are. I'm a symbolic knowledge worker all the way. But thinking about what Matthew Crawford had to say about repairing motorcycles, and of course he's not arguing that we all learn to repair motorcycles, but rather that we think about these kinds of craft-oriented tasks and what they can do for us. Led me to think, we love motorcycles, we love to repair things or do things like that, but there are many things that all of us do every day that are also embedded in many other kinds of systems in our world. And wouldn't it change our world and maybe help us address some of our wicked problems, which of course we know it would, if we thought about these things with as much attention as we think about many of the other things in our day. So cooking, for example, is something that not enough Americans do. People don't cook enough meals at home, and I'm not going to go into all the statistics on this score, but cooking at home, cooking even a few more meals per week would change our dietary habits, our food consumption habits, would change the health of this nation. And in California, people are pretty healthy. But in other parts of America and around the world, this is a serious problem. In any case, cooking, cuisine, is a cultural activity, but it's also a physical one. It's something that we do with our hands, that we can take pleasure in, that grounds us in a space. It can be relaxing as an activity, but it's also something that we can do to interact with our history, the history of our families, the history of the places that we've been, the things that we've, the tastes that we've enjoyed. Food is culture, is what I'm saying here. It's not simply, nutrition. It's culture. It's something that we engage with in that way. Food is also a gift that we can give to someone else when we cook for someone. So it's not simply cooking to enjoy the physical activity, it's cooking to offer a meal to someone else. And to evoke those tastes, to think about maybe offering the gift of comfort food to someone who's had a rough week or whatever it might be. Cooking, of course, though, is also an economic choice. And there I don't mean it simply in the sense that we want to economize, but rather that when we think about how we buy, what we buy, where we buy, what we buy, what systems we're buying into when we buy what we buy, making all those choices in a thoughtful manner. And again, this is the Alvin Toffler prosumer moment, where we're voting with our dollars and changing the world a little bit, small ways, by making those choices. Cuisine, of course, in that sense, is also a political act, because making those food economic choices can have ramifications that are far larger than just us at the grocery store. So thinking about the domestic arts more broadly, I think about the way that they are networked and interconnected, the way that they feed into and layer on one another: architecture, interior design, industrial product design, fashion, gardening, cuisine, and of course there are others. But they're nested within one another, the way that our architecture shapes our interiors, that our interiors shapes our the kinds of objects that we can have in our spaces, and the way that these objects and object choices can shape our experience of ourselves. And here I'm thinking of times when I visited people, like my brother, for example, who built a house a few years ago, and he said, "I want a house that looks like a house." And he went too quickly into a place, got a guy to build him a house that looks like a house, and now he realizes all of the ways that he wishes he could change that house that looks like a house, and how difficult it is for him on a daily basis. In any case, these domestic arts are nested and networked. They're connected to one another. They feed one another. They're patterns that are patterns within themselves, patterns within society, and patterns that relate to one another. So I'm stepping back from those kinds of things. I love this notion. W.H. Auden, the poet, has a great essay on what it takes to become a poet. How do you be a poet? And Gary Snyder has a similar one, and a similar list of things that it takes to become a poet. And one of the things that they both share on their list, poets as diverse as W.H. Auden and Gary Snyder, they both recommend that we have gardens and take care of animals. A domestic animal. What happens when you take care of a domestic animal? What sort of interbeing relationships can we experience from that? Let's get that part. But thinking about this gardening question, the way that gardens, as a part of that domestic space, gardens can be food for our cuisine. Gardens can be relaxation. Gardens can be many things. As a domestic art, they can be fuel for our poetry. The chef Dan Barber, in his recent book, The Third Plate, talks about how chefs can help us reinvent cuisine in America by working with farmers, which is to say people who grow gardens, to invent new tastes that are not simply local tastes in the sense of locally grown food, because a lot of locally grown food is really food, plants that weren't necessarily indigenous to this place, or that don't necessarily grow well under the climatic conditions of this place. So it's not simply eating locally that matters, it's eating in this ecology that matters. And not even that, it's thinking about the appropriate ecology for this, the appropriate cuisine for this ecology. That's what Dan Barber's interested in. And the part that connects it to my ecological imagination element is that the chef is there to be the imagination, to help us invent that cuisine that can create the taste that will lead the farmer to grow the food that we will then eat. All of those connections that they can be had and enjoyed. In Japanese art, something like the tea ceremony is another exemplar of this. The tea ceremony is the thing that it's the highest art of the traditional arts in Japan. It's an art of the moment. It's about the uniqueness of that experience. It's about architecture. It's about interior design. It's about performance. It's about flowers. It's about sustenance. It's about being with the people you're with. And it's an utter challenge to our museums. So, my sort of parting shots here. What am I asking for? I'm asking for us to reimagine the domestic arts as arts of living, and more so as modes of what I'm calling this ecological imagination, modes of connectivity. But I'm also asking us to reconstitute our social institutions, schools, and museums to support these arts. So, again, tea ceremony, utter challenge to our museums. Our museums are about separated objects that we look at from afar. What if we imagine museums as places of connection as opposed to separation? Education. What if we started to study in those foundational courses that, say, freshmen take at college? This is what I spent a lot of time thinking about as an educator. What if we reimagine those freshman seminars as seminars in the arts of living, and the things that are most directly connected to the way that we actually live, as opposed to, the training in the higher arts, the fine art tradition that we use in those places now. So, related to that, what if we shifted our interest away from the autonomous arts into the domestic arts? We studied those things not simply from the outside, how does design work, what is it, but from the inside, what is it to exercise intentionality in our domestic spaces? So as a practice.